Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be unpacking some really specific rules about priests in ancient Israel from the book of Leviticus, chapter 21.
Okay.
It's all about exploring their concept of holiness, something that might seem pretty foreign to us now.
Yeah, it's interesting how holiness wasn't just some abstract concept for them. It was deeply embedded in their daily lives and tied to very specific actions and even appearances.
Right, and it's not just a history lesson. It actually makes you think about our own ideas of worthiness and what it means to be set apart today. But first, for context, in ancient Israel, priests weren't just religious figures. They were intermediaries between God and the people, so their holiness was a big deal.
Absolutely. These rules weren't arbitrary. They were meant to maintain a distinct boundary between the sacred and the profane.
Okay, so one of the first things that caught my eye was this rule about priests and contact with the dead. Leviticus 21.1 says they couldn't be around dead bodies except for close family. Why so specific?
So death was associated with ritual impurity for the Israelites. Priests, as representatives of God's holiness, had to avoid anything that could compromise that purity. It's like they were protecting their sacred status, their ability to interact with the divine on behalf of the people.
So even in death, there were boundaries they had to maintain.
Right.
But then they list the exceptions. Parents, children, siblings, even an unmarried virgin sister.
Yeah.
Why those specific family members?
That's where it gets interesting. It suggests that some relationships were considered so fundamental that even death couldn't sever that connection entirely. It speaks to the complex interplay between their religious obligations and those deep family ties. It wasn't just about avoiding contamination. It was about navigating the nuances of different kinds of relationships.
It makes you think about how those rules would actually play out in their lives. Like imagine having to make that choice between religious duty and being there for a family member in their final moments. That's heavy.
It certainly highlights how these rules weren't just theoretical. They had very real and sometimes difficult consequences for people's lives.
Okay, moving on to something a little lighter, at least on the surface. Leviticus 21.5 talks about a priest's physical appearance. No shaved heads, no trimmed beards, no cuts on their bodies. I'd have to admit that one made me chuckle. Talk about a strict dress code.
Well, in many ancient cultures, hair and beards were seen as symbols of strength and even holiness. But for the Israelites, altering them might have been seen as rejecting the body's natural state, which they believed reflected God's creation. It wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about respecting the body as a sacred thing.
So presenting yourself to God in a way that demonstrated reverence.
Right.
But it also makes you wonder about their views on physical perfection. Were they equating a certain look with spiritual purity?
That's a great question. It definitely suggests that they saw a connection between physical wholeness and spiritual preparedness to serve. And this wasn't unique to the Israelites. Many cultures throughout history have held similar beliefs about outward appearances reflecting inner states of being.
Okay, so now let's get into the rules about marriage. And fair warning, things get a little intense here. Leviticus 21 puts some major restrictions on who a priest could marry. No divorced women, no women who had been prostitutes, and no women from outside the Israelite community. What was the thinking behind all of that?
This is where understanding the social context is really important. Lineage and maintaining a pure bloodline were huge in ancient Israel, especially for priests. They were seen as guardians of the nation's religious purity. And that responsibility extended to their children who would eventually inherit their roles. It's all about preserving that priestly line.
So marriage wasn't just a personal choice. It was about ensuring the continuation of a specific lineage and maintaining the purity of that line.
Exactly. And to really understand how seriously they took this, we have to look at the punishment outlined for a priest's daughter who engaged in prostitution. Leviticus 21.9 states she was to be burned to death.
Wow. That's pretty extreme. What do you make of such a harsh punishment?
It definitely reflects the immense weight they placed on the sanctity of the priesthood. They believed that even one act like this could taint the sacred lineage. Remember, a priest's daughter could potentially mother future priests. So her actions had implications that went way beyond her individual choices.
It was about the impact on the community as a whole, on their religious and social order.
Precisely. It emphasizes how their religious, social, and legal systems were all interwoven.
It's a good reminder that we can't just look at these rules in isolation. We have to consider the whole cultural context they were embedded in.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this so fascinating. It's a window into a completely different way of thinking about the world, about family, about religion, about the very nature of what it means to be holy.
Okay, so we've covered purity, appearance, and marriage. But Leviticus 21 doesn't stop there. It also lists specific physical imperfections that would disqualify someone from serving as a priest. And this is where things get really interesting, because it forces us to confront our own assumptions about worthiness and what it means to be chosen by a higher power.
It's true. Leviticus 21.11621 lists a number of physical flaws that would prevent a man from approaching the altar. To offer sacrifices to God, blindness, lameness, deformities, skin conditions, even a crushed testicle. It's a pretty extensive list.
But here's the part that really surprised me. The text says these individuals weren't inherently unworthy in God's eyes. They could still eat the holy food. They were still part of the community. It wasn't an all-or-nothing situation.
Right, and that's a crucial distinction. It suggests that while physical wholeness was seen as ideal for performing priestly duties, it didn't completely exclude someone from participating in their faith. They were still considered deserving of spiritual sustenance, even if their physical limitations prevented them from taking on certain roles.
So there were levels of holiness, different ways of participating within the temple itself.
Exactly, and that's where the detail about not being able to approach the altar or the special curtain comes in. Leviticus 21.23 specifically says that those with physical imperfections couldn't enter these most sacred spaces.
What do you think that tells us about how they viewed those spaces and the varying degrees of holiness within the temple itself?
It reinforces this idea of a hierarchy of holiness. The altar and the special curtain, probably referring to the veil separating the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple, were seen as the most sacred areas. Not everyone, even within the priesthood, had equal access to those areas.
So it's about degrees of separation, even within the priesthood. It's not just about being a priest or not. It's about where you stand within that system and how your physical form determined your proximity to the divine.
Exactly. And it all comes back to this central idea of physical wholeness reflecting spiritual purity and suitability for serving God. Those with imperfections, while not deemed inherently unworthy, were seen as less suited for the most intimate and sacred aspects of priestly duties.
So even within this seemingly rigid set of rules, there were layers of nuance and interpretation. It wasn't quite as black and white as it might appear at first glance.
Right. And it prompts us to ask, how much have our own ideas about physical perfection and spiritual worthiness really changed? Do we still hold certain biases, consciously or unconsciously, about how those in religious roles should look or present themselves? It's a question worth pondering.
And it's not just about religion. Think about all the ways we judge people based on their appearance in everyday life. It makes you wonder how much progress we've really made in terms of valuing people for who they are, rather than how they look.
Absolutely. It's a question that transcends time and culture. It's fascinating how these rules, while rooted in a specific time and place, still resonate with us today. They challenge us to think about how our own societies define worthiness and belonging.
It's true. And, it's easy to get caught up in the do's and don'ts of these ancient laws, but I think what's really interesting is what they reveal about the underlying values and beliefs of the Israelite community.
Absolutely. Take, for instance, those marriage restrictions we talked about earlier. It wasn't just about ritual purity. It also had a profound impact on their social structure.
Right, like you were saying before, lineage was a big deal. But I'm curious, how did those restrictions on marriage play into the power dynamics within their society?
Well, by dictating who priests could marry, they were effectively controlling the flow of power and influence within the priestly class. It kept priestly families interconnected and ensured they maintained their privileged position.
So it wasn't just about preserving a bloodline, it was about preserving a certain social order as well.
Exactly. And this idea of lineage and inheritance was central to their whole understanding of the priesthood. It wasn't just a job you could apply for. It was a hereditary role passed down through generations.
Which makes those rules about physical imperfections even more significant. Imagine the pressure on a family knowing a minor blemish could mean the difference between their son following in his father's footsteps or being barred from the priesthood entirely. It must have been incredibly stressful.
Absolutely. It really underscores how these rules weren't just abstract concepts. They had very real and potentially life-altering consequences for individuals and families.
Okay, so we've talked about the specific rules and how they played into their social structures. But let's zoom out a bit. What does all of this tell us about the Israelite concept of holiness on a broader level?
For them, holiness wasn't just about being morally good or following the rules. It was about being set apart, distinct, and right relationship with God. It was about embodying a certain state of being.
So it was an identity, not just a set of actions.
Exactly. And that's why physical wholeness was so important. It was seen as a reflection of inner purity and readiness to approach the divine.
It's interesting, that idea that your physical state could somehow mirror your spiritual state.
Right, and this isn't a concept unique to the Israelites. Throughout history, many cultures have linked outward appearances to inner qualities. It's a powerful and enduring idea.
It really makes you think about our own modern assumptions about beauty and worthiness, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
We might not have these specific rules about physical imperfections anymore, but we still live in a society that places a lot of value on outward appearances.
Absolutely. Think about the pressure to conform to certain standards of beauty, especially in the age of social media. While the context is different, the underlying messages can be surprisingly similar.
It makes you wonder how much progress we've really made in terms of valuing people for who they are rather than how they look.
It's a crucial question, and it gets to the heart of what we're exploring here. What does it truly mean to be holy? The answer, as we're seeing, is far more complex than we might initially think. It's not just about outward actions or achieving some level of external perfection. It's about cultivating a way of being, a way of relating to ourselves, to others, and to something greater than ourselves.
So how do we bridge the gap between this ancient understanding of holiness and our own modern sensibilities? How do we reconcile the tension between tradition and progress, between these enduring beliefs and our ever-evolving worldview?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer, but I think the first step is acknowledging the complexity of it all. There are no simple solutions or quick fixes.
Right. It's about engaging in a thoughtful and respectful dialogue, one that recognizes the value of tradition while also embracing the possibility of growth and change.
Exactly. And recognizing that holiness isn't a destination, it's a journey. A lifelong process of becoming, of striving to align ourselves with something greater than ourselves in a way that resonates deeply with our own experiences and understanding.
So it's about finding that balance between respecting the wisdom of the past and embracing the possibilities of the present.
Precisely. And understanding that true holiness doesn't lie in outward appearances or rigid adherence to rules, but in the compassion, love, and grace we extend to ourselves and to others.
It's about recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of every human being, regardless of their physical appearance, their social standing, or their perceived imperfections.
Well said. And that, I believe, is a message that speaks to the very essence of what it means to be human. A message that transcends time and culture.
It's amazing how these ancient texts, despite their distance from our own time, can still spark such profound and relevant conversations. It's incredible how relevant these ancient ideas about holiness still feel. Well, I've been talking about the rules from Leviticus 21, but I'm thinking it's not just about priests in ancient Israel, right? It's about how we all navigate these questions of worthiness and belonging even today.
What's so compelling is how these rules provide a lens for examining those questions. They weren't just about outward appearances, they were about the very fabric of their society.
Right. Like we discussed these rules about marriage, and physical imperfections weren't arbitrary. They were intertwined with their concepts of lineage, inheritance, and even social order.
And that's why I think it's important to not just analyze the rules themselves, but to consider their wider implications. How did these ideas shape individuals' lives? How did they affect their sense of self?
It makes you think about the human stories behind these ancient texts, the anxieties and hopes, the challenges and triumphs of people trying to live according to these ideals.
Exactly. Imagine a young man approaching adulthood, aware that a minor physical difference could determine his entire future. Or a woman whose marital options were limited by her social standing or past experiences. These rules had a profound impact on their lives.
It's a powerful reminder that these ancient texts weren't just abstract theological concepts. They were lived realities for people navigating the complexities of their time.
And in many ways, we're still grappling with similar questions today. How much do our appearances, our backgrounds, or perceived imperfections influence our sense of worth and our place in the world?
It's like those ancient ideas about holiness have morphed and adapted over time, but they haven't completely disappeared. We might express them differently, but those underlying concerns about belonging and acceptance are still very much present.
Absolutely. And I think that's where the real value of exploring these ancient texts lies. They provide a framework for examining our own beliefs and assumptions, for challenging the norms and expectations that shape our lives.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the concept of holiness in ancient Israel, what would you say is the most important lesson for our listener to take away?
I think it's about cultivating that critical awareness we've been talking about, questioning the messages we receive both from the past and from our own culture about what it means to be worthy, to be accepted, to be whole.
And remembering that true holiness, true worthiness, isn't something we achieve through outward conformity or adherence to a rigid set of rules. It's about recognizing the inherent value and dignity of every person, regardless of their appearance, their background, or their perceived imperfections. It's about embracing our shared humanity and striving to create a world where everyone feels a sense of belonging and purpose.
Beautifully said. And ultimately, I believe that's a message that transcends time and culture, a message that speaks to the deepest longings of the human heart.
Thanks for joining us for this thought-provoking deep dive into the world of ancient Israelite priests and the concept of holiness. We hope it sparks some new insights and questions for you to ponder as you navigate your own journey.
It's been a pleasure exploring these fascinating ideas with you.
And until next time, keep diving deep.